I'm Leon Clowes, and I'm a transdisciplinary artist completing my practice research PhD at London College of Music, University of West London. The focus of my study is on uses of autoethnographic techniques in grief-informed creative practice. Autoethnography is a qualitative research method where the researcher uses personal experiences to explore and reflect on broader cultural, social, or theoretical issues. I believe autoethnographic practices can offer nuanced ways of exploring difficult lived experiences within artworks, and so this has been the focus of my creative practice research since the beginning of 2022. This presentation is part of the second Access and Diversity strand at the 21st Century Music Practice Conference, which is taking place in the Pete Townshend studio on 9th and 10th of September 2024 at London College of Music. Our panel's title is Auto Constructive Art, the Potentiality of Pete Townshend CEMI Collection for Artists in Recovery. Leah Kardos is the chair of this panel. She is a musician, writer, composer and academic who co-founded the Tony Visconti studio at Kingston University. I want to highlight and credit the socially engaged performance practices with people in recovery that my supervisor, Cathy Sloan, researches and platforms at London College of Music. Although Cathy is not part of this panel, it wouldn't be happening without her. After Cathy ran a knowledge exchange event here in September 2022, she worked with Alex Mazonowicz to begin Performing Recovery, a quarterly magazine. It is the official publication of the Addiction Recovery Arts Network and was seed funded by University of West London. My presentation touches on how isolation and disconnection lead to artistic failure. Alex's presentation is a celebration of recovery and connection as a musician. The third presentation is from Greg Smith, who, along with Cathy and Jez Wiles, piloted a music project with veterans who are in recovery from PTSD. My presentation has a content warning. Within the next 15 minutes, I will make references which draw from my personal experience of alcoholism, drug taking, sex and bullying. All the juicy stuff, basically. And just for good measure, there's 2 very mild swear words. So, with all that introduction out of the way, let us begin. Re-emerging as an artist, aged 50 in 2020, with the professional production facilities and expertise available here at London College of Music, I had high hopes of recording my electronic pop music compositions from the late 1980s as a central strand of my practice research. However, my reluctance and avoidance of doing this project has greatly irritated me. In the 2.5 years since I began a PhD in music here at UWL, I have had no problems creating and delivering numerous new compositions, performances, installations. I have been drafting my thesis on schedule, written articles and managed the social media for Performing Recovery magazine, and worked with Cathy to deliver 2 large-scale events at the university. Meeting deadlines in good time and realising other major projects has never once been a problem for me in the last 3 years. So, for the next 15 minutes, I'm going to consider what might have caused the sadness behind my failure to finally record teenage pop songs that I wrote 30 years ago. Is it because I'm a queerdo? That given the life circumstances that I've come from and experienced, am I more weird than queer? Was earlier loss and grief the reasons behind the procrastination and discontent resulting in this abandoned creativity? By reflecting on possible underlying contributors behind my irascibility, I believe this may throw some wider insight to what longer-term effects of unresolved lived grief can be. The first 2 parts of this presentation will be an autoethnographic historical perspective. First, I reflect on how my creativity was derailed as active addiction of alcohol and drugs took hold during the 1990s. I then trace further back to the daily homophobic teenage bullying at school which I had to endure at the peak of the AIDS crisis, and how I felt an outsider to an outsider's world, that being the queer community. During this fraught and difficult time, I made electronic pop songs in my bedroom. This provided vital catharsis and necessary comfort. For the final part of this presentation, I will analyse a present-day symptom of this personal history. I will unpick how, as Sian Guy clarifies, irritation might be perceived as a wrong way of feeling, but, as she suggests, it could be a longitudinal effect of forms of oppression. But by taking a proactive approach of liberating my research lens from that of queer identity that I don't identify with, and by instead realigning my focus on the weirdness of my artistic practice, I am better able to manage my sovereignty and independence from being wrongly pigeonholed. So first, back to the 1990s. There is a particularity to my age group, the white gay British males of Generation X. As Matthew Todd reports, many of us are now in therapy and in recovery rooms. In the mid-90s, the UK's age of consent for homosexual men shifted from age 21 to 18. Societal attitudes were changing. Also, in some quarters, the use of recreational drugs became widespread, affordable, normalised and celebrated. However, while conditions were improving for many in what Heather Love described as the well-heeled lesbian and gay worlds, the mainstream persecution of gay men during the 1980s AIDS crisis had had a profound impact on me during teenage years. And so, in the 1990s, while at the time I thought I was having the best times of my life, in actuality, the creep of addiction to alcohol and drugs was a reaction to what had gone before. Academics Amico, Butler, Aronoff and Gilboa define gay music of the time. Disco divas such as Cher, Sinita and Madonna would be played on rotation in the mostly gay male bars. The pumped and fashion-smart Compton Street brasserie crowd was not for me though, so in my 20s I struggled when entering queer social scenes. Much like David Halperin, I felt little affinity for the kinds of music that those gay men embraced. In my 20s, in conversations with both gay and straight people, very often the assumption would be that I would embrace the gay music that was part of the social scene of those gay men. My reaction to this would be one of irk and annoyance. Forget Eurovision, Handbag House, musical theatre and Kylie Bloody Minogue. I was a serious music listener with good taste. Instead, I was enraptured by noisy 1980s electronica, awkward art rock, and 1960s northern soul. Second, to the 1980s, my teenage years. Raised in a rural white working class English village, it was obvious to everyone that I was gay. This fragile becoming was happening in a frenzied time. Public hysteria was high about what Prince called the big disease with a little name. As Matthew Todd forensically examines, the negative rhetoric of contemporary religious leaders, newspaper editors and senior police figures validated mainstream culture, vindicating violence and intimidation towards gay men. Section 28 threatened teachers with legislative action should homosexuality be promoted in the classroom. This hostile environment was frightening and mentally destructive. Social acceptance during adolescence is critical to good mental health. At school, I was isolated, ridiculed, bullied. In my village, everyone knew everyone's business. I was at pains to conceal my sexuality from my family. The internet did not exist for communities of shared experiences. Unlike Matthew Todd in 1980s London, I was not part of a queer teenager community group. Where I lived, there was none on offer. I can't speak of ever feeling gay pride or justified anger. Growing up, I was just managing to cope. Where I did find comfort, release and solace was in music. Beginning with the Bowie, Tamla and T-Rex records in my mother's collection, I would then embrace alternative 80s counterculture, the weird worlds of Fad Gadget, Fetus and Cabaret Voltaire. Writing my own electro-pop songs was an outlet and internal processing. But this music wasn't made to be heard by anyone else. My way of coping was concealment. Although I was young, shame had already become ingrained. The music I made was not gay music for those gay men. The time of fear around the onset of the AIDS crisis coincided with my nascent sexuality. The songs I wrote, I now realise, were prophecy. They foretold the traits of decades that lay ahead: codependency, unsafe sex, alcohol and drugs as social props. My electro-pop songs were mind maps of a terrified, mixed-up gay adolescent. The first synth-based pop song I wrote, A Love Divine, has a couplet typical of my lyrical preoccupations of the time. The words are, shoot me with your AIDS gun, pierce me and deflate me. These two lines simultaneously capture my defiance and acceptance of the fate expected of and for gay men of the time. Living in the times and circumstances I did, it felt essential to move to London as swiftly as possible, and getting a grant to go to university was my escape route. But still, I didn't really fit in anywhere. At university, the musicians were trained in classical traditions and I was into weird electronic pop. In the gay bars and clubs I was entering, I despised the music. I attributed this not fitting in on the gay male social scene because of the bad music played in gay bars. This was the reason I had to get drunk when I went out. In reality, of course, this was utter nonsense. I was fast becoming an addict, easily irritated by trifling matters, always looking for a reason to drink or get high. A template of self-destruction had been laid out in my electro-pop songs, and this was now being played out in real time and in real life. Next, on to the final part, present-day irritation. Cian Guy defines irritation as a low-intensity negative affect. The aboutness of emotions that Sarah Ahmed speaks of in the case of irascibility has a wrongness about it. Guy, in drawing from Aristotle's view towards this reaction, crystallises how the fault of the peak mood is perceived to belong to the person feeling this sensation rather than the protagonist's action that trigger this response. In examining the reactions of Helga in Nella Larsen's 1928 Quicksand novel, Guy considers how the lead character's cultural cachet is dictated by race and class. However, Guy proposed that the irritation Helga internalises is rooted in something deeper. As a socially thwarted writer, the fictional character Helga is uneasy when identifying with groups or places she is externally associated with because of the colour of her skin. As readers, Guy proposes we note a conspicuous inadequacy in Helga's lack of outward response towards flagrantly aggressive and racist actions of the white man on the train. Guy attributes that irritability, rather than anger, is potentially a way to mask or strategically distance Helga from deeper emotions she is unwilling to express. While I make no claim of understanding the experience of being a biracial woman in a white-dominated society in 1920s America, there are two things here that personally resonate about Guy's analysis on this fictional character's reaction. Firstly, Helga is middle class. She has a negative view of the black people on the train, yet to the racist white man, she is the same as them. People make all kinds of assumptions about me because I'm gay. One of these is that I must like the same gay music that those gay men like. Secondly, Helga is an artist, frustrated by how the society she lives in oppresses her creative potential. Instead of pursuing the music I studied in my early 20s, I spent 30 years in active addiction. This lost time for me is one of regret, and trying to recreate songs I wrote 30 years ago has evoked sadness and despondency. As Guy outlines, irritation is a mood, distinct from emotion in that it lacks an explicit occasion or object. I only have to open my mouth and people know I am queer, so I wonder if frequent external affirming of my otherness has perhaps resulted in an internal shutting down that compounds my irascibility. Am I hiding a deeper sense of sorrow and regret? As Ray Terada says, people deploy emotion in epistemologically defensive ways. So to conclude then, what next for this weird old gay? In the final few months of my research, I'll be exploring Cameron Dodd's emerging weirding as process methods and Eric Davis's high weirdness to frame the analysis of my creative practice. By doing this, I regain control of my cultural persona rather than badly fitting into a generalised and all-encompassing identity based on my sexuality. As Quiver Macavinche wrote, any singularity of approach negates the glorious complexity of human beings and how fluid, accommodating, or even contradictory our identities and notions of community can be. Creativity can offer fluidity and advancement of identity. Regarding effective recovery-engaged arts practices, Kathy Sloan emphasises how performance presents the possibilities to form, reform, and reimagine the social contexts of people in recovery. The methodology of my final thesis will combine the artistic and activist approaches of Simon Zagorski-Thomas alongside the messy connections of Kathy Sloan's addiction recovery engaged performance practices. As a musician who trained as a teenager and in my 20s, my lens of irritation and avoidance was long perpetuated by active addiction for several decades. By forging practice research techniques with a self-compassionate approach, I do not aim to celebrate what Jack Halberstam does through queer failure. Instead, I embrace a failure to be queer, and so this research will focus on my weird creative practices instead. What I previously perceived as failures, the not fitting in with the other gays, the years lost to alcohol and drugs, the weird electro songs that will be heard by no one, this is now balanced by coming to terms with facing the irritation and suppression I harboured for nearly 3 decades. Finally, then, I propose that by drawing a line on the past and by thinking through the whys to the, yes, this is why I get so wound up, so annoyed, so pissed off. By knowing this, I can allow myself to inhabit a better present, and through that I then fuel my voracious appetite to envisage a brighter future. And that is the very best I can hope to be.